So let me dive in a little bit more, okay? Because I know weight cutting is a big issue, definitely, and everybody wants to know, and everybody's getting fed wrong information. So I want to go with an expert to really break this down. Now, how important is the rehydration process after weigh-ins? And since the UFC doesn't allow IV use anymore, in your opinion, what is the most effective way to get a fighter back to close to 100%? And obviously, if that's even possible.
Yeah, great question, and I love the way you phrased it, because is that possible? And I think there's a host of factors. One, the obvious: how vicious was the cut, right? Mm-hmm. And how extreme was the cut? The key thing, I think, here's the obvious. One of the things that what happens is at the professional level, at the elite level, at the guys who wore the belts, I've been blessed to work with in Bellator, McGeary, Galvo, guys, Weidman, obviously, a lot of guys who have had belts in MMA and in boxing. And the good news for them is, hey, they know 3 months, 4 months in advance when their fight is. And that makes the cut easier, which makes the rehi a little bit easier, providing they're doing what they should. Where it becomes really difficult is the guys who are working their way up the scale, right? And all of a sudden they get a call in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks, hey, so-so broke his hand, you want to jump in.
Yeah.
And those extreme weight cuts become brutal. And their demand on lean muscle tissue loss and fat loss is mitigated. Well, let me take that back. Their lean muscle tissue loss and water loss has to be greater because there's been much less time for fat loss. Under those circumstances, to your point, Phil, it gets much harder to do the rehi, but the rehi is vital. What are we trying to accomplish? Well, you have an athlete that is going to be very glycogen depleted. So the best we can do first is say their liver, depending upon the size of the athlete. I wish I had a device that would measure this in specificity. There's a new device called Muscle Sounds that tells you the percentage of glycogen storage that athlete may have, but not the grams. But the first thing I look at is I got to get an estimation in my mind. Okay, here's an athlete that probably holds about 500 grams of muscle glycogen, maybe 100 grams of liver glycogen. They're probably down to 200. What's the first thing I know? I got to get that glycogen back in them. Okay, sure. Vital. If I get the glycogen back in them, that helps to bring and helps to facilitate the intramuscular storage of not only carbohydrate but water. The other thing I've got to do is, what do I need? I need vast amounts of electrolytes. Yes. I try to get the fighters. I eat 6 or 7 colors over and over again throughout the course of the rehi or the meal process. Got to get in magnesium, potassium. So the point to this is even a tough weight cut can be mitigated if we do everything right. And off the scale, immediate fluid, as you know, immediate carbohydrate. And usually I like powders because, we don't want to force heavy digestion. We want to facilitate in the electrolytes, the glycogen. But if we can get water back in every compartment, which I believe we can, which is intracellular, through the right electrolytes, right, and the muscles inside the muscle, through the right electrolytes, through good glycogen intake, interstitially, with the right balance of sodium, potassium, magnesium, get that water in between the cells. The plasma immediately, because you know how dehydrated these athletes are, their blood plasma is down. So really, we talk, Phil, in terms, and Jason, of 3 compartments. We got to put water back in. We got to put it back inside the cell, outside the cell, back in the blood. But there's really a 4th compartment, and that's the brain. Because the dehydration of the brain, as you well know, leads to really, really attenuated performance, cognitive processing. So essentially now we got 36 hours, in some cases, depending upon an 8 a.m. weigh-in and maybe a 10 p.m. fight, to 34 hours to say, okay, we can really back up or reverse this tough weight cut with the right foods, the right fluids, the right intake of carbohydrates, protein, the right timing, and we could lessen the damage, if you will, of that cut and try to optimize performance. Either way, it's not easy. It's a tough, short window to get it done, but I really believe it needs to be done. You can't go out and go get a Slurpee and a Big Mac and wow, like some guys are still doing.
No, that does.
So anyway, my point to that is it's nothing, no great revelation. It needs to be systematic. Know what they need: potassium, sodium, magnesium, carbohydrates. How many grams? They're probably going to need 1,500 to 2,000 grams of carbohydrate intake from the time they get off a scale to the time they go into the fight. How much water? Well, you continue to weigh, right? Get off the scale. All right, here's how many pounds we gained 4 or 5 hours later. What's the urine color? Use a refractometer and say, hey, wow, looks like we're getting rehydrated here. And those are all some of the things we can do, guys.
I have a question for both of you, because you bring up the water thing. Now, my brain, I always think of when there are people weight cutting, I think of Raging Bull and De Niro's in the sauna sweating, can't have a piece of ice. Like, when you guys are weight cutting with a fighter, how much water are they allowed to even drink or intake or any fluids at all when they're in that very close within an hour of weigh-in? Are they not allowed to eat or drink? Because I see some of them have to do physical exercise to cut more weight, but I would figure you need the energy, the water, or even the food to fuel that. Like, how does that work out, to fuel more weight cuts so close?
Phil, it first, and then I'll join in if you want.
Well, I mean, it really just depends on how close they are and weight.
Yeah.
Usually, if a guy is close, I would say, 3 to 5 pounds. I'd give them a sip or two, maybe even just wash their mouth out. But it really just depends. Like I said, it's all subjective. And at that last minute, and we're talking, you definitely want to make sure that they're not consuming anything else that they're going to put on, especially if they're really close. But I don't necessarily like to put on any added cortisol release into the system, just because, you're already damaging the body in general from cutting the weight. Yeah. So a lot of like heavy exercises, like pad work and things like that, I do like to not, I don't like to do that primarily. Baths and things like that, sauna sessions. I'm not too big of a fan. I'd really just like to have them rest as much as possible, get the cortisol down so they can actually disperse that weight as efficient as they can. Toni, do you have anything to say on that one?
No, yeah, really good point on the cortisol, Phil, and you're right. And Jason, you brought up a point. So to an extent, a passive weight cut, if possible. And Phil's point is well taken too on the baths and the sauna. However, if given the option and they have to pull that water out, to Phil's point, I'd rather do that than sit there and kick Tide pads for 3 hours, because if I can spare glycogen, if I can relax my nervous system, if I, that's imperative. I don't want to keep taxing the body right up to the scale, because I'd like to get some rest. So that's a wonderful point. And as far as the water, to your point as well, Jace, here's how I look at it. The capacity to turn water over and pull it is going to be contingent upon the fighter's behavior throughout the camp. So a lot of people like to water load. And I always say, well, water loading is fine, but if you just water load the whole camp, because the more water you drink, the higher the turnover. Yeah, exactly. So what I always look for is, I'm in the fight gyms. I'm like Phil. I'm not in a separate gym. So I get to watch my fighters. I get to weigh them before and after a sparring session. And if they're turning over 4 or 5 pounds per session, that's great, because then I know their fluid intake is sufficient and their water turnover is going to be high. And then when they try to pull that water for their cut, it's going to be easier. But if my fighter's in there and they're working 2 hours and they're dropping 1 pound, the likely case is that their fluid intake is not sufficient and their turnover isn't very high. So how much water that fighter can take in the day before is really contingent upon how effective their turnover is. I'll send these guys in a little bit of a sauna 5 or 6 weeks out just for a half hour, just to find out how much water they're losing. So I can at least get an indication on how effective their turnover is. But if it's not high, if they can't pull water out easily, then they're going to have a hard time. They're going to need the baths.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good statement. I like the fact that you stated that these guys need to be adequately hydrated throughout the entire camp. They're athletes. They're high-level athletes. They're professionals. And even if you're an amateur, you need to practice like a professional. And definitely, water intake is a big deal, man. And that was always said, the more water you put in, the less water you actually hold. So great insight.
Exactly.
As always.
If you are a fighter or someone who wants to start training in MMA, listen up. My name is Phil Daru. I am the head performance coach of American Top Team. I train some of the elite MMA athletes in the world, such as Dustin Poirier, King Mo Lawal, Frankie Edgar, Junior Dos Santos, Edson Barboza, and Joanna Jedrzejczyk. Going to MMA gyms or hiring a personal trainer can get extremely expensive over time. So if you want to get in shape and train using the exact program of the top MMA fighters for an affordable one-time price, check out Fight Ready in the description below.